Preston Caldwell didn't even let her unpack her canvas grip. He looked at the alkali dust on her sensible boots, the drab cotton of her high-collared dress, and the utter lack of paint on her face. He told the stage driver to keep her fair. Candy was too plain, he said loud enough for the whole mercantile porch to hear. She was a plough horse at a thoroughbred race. He sent her away. But Preston didn't reckon on where the stagecoach would break down, or who was watching from the timberline. The town of Bitter Creek faded into a blur of brown and grey out the stagecoach window. Candy sat rigidly on the cracked leather seat. Her hands remained folded in her lap. Her knuckles were white. Not from crying. Candy didn't cry. Tears were a waste of water out here in the high territory, and she had learned long ago that crying didn't change the shape of the world. She felt the heavy sway of the coach, the relentless grinding of the wheels over rutted earth. Across from her, the empty seat seemed to mock her. A mail-order bride sent back via return post. Preston Caldwell had taken one look at her at the depot. He'd expected the retouched photograph to be a lie, perhaps, but he hadn't expected the truth to be quite so uncompromising. She was 26 built, for hauling water and scrubbing floors, with shoulders broader than was fashionable, and a face that was severe in its sharp angles. She had no softness, no dimples, no coy smiles. "I ordered a wife, not a scrub woman," Preston had told the station master, waving a dismissive kid-gloved hand. "Put her back on the afternoon coach. Tell the agency they owe me a refund." Candy hadn't argued. She had simply turned around, hoisted her own grip, and climbed back into the stifling heat of the carriage. She had exactly $4 to her name. It wasn't enough to get back to St. Louis. It was barely enough to buy a decent meal at the next relay station. She watched the scrub brush roll by. The land out here was unforgiving, stripped bare by the wind and the sun. She felt a certain kinship to it. The driver, a sour old man named Hodges, whipped the team harder than necessary. He wanted to clear the pass before nightfall. The sky above the jagged teeth of the Bitterroot Mountains was already bruising purple heavy with the threat of a late-season snow. An hour passed, then 2. The road steepened, narrowing to a treacherous shelf carved into the side of the mountain. The air grew thin and bit at Candy's exposed neck. She pulled her thin shawl tighter. Then came the crack. It sounded like a cannon shot echoing off the canyon walls. The carriage pitched violently to the left. Candy was thrown against the wooden wall, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. The horses screamed. Hodges shouted a string of foul curses, cutting through the thin air. The carriage groaned, slid 3 feet toward the sheer drop-off, and stopped with a sickening lurch. Candy pushed herself up, her head ringing. She forced the door open and climbed out into the biting wind. The rear axle had sheared clean through. The heavy wooden wheel lay flat in the dirt, the coach resting on its underbelly. Hodges was already unhitching the frantic horses, his face pale beneath the grime. "We're done," he spat, not looking at her. "Axle's busted. Can't fix it here." "What do we do?" Candy asked. Her voice was steady. It surprised even her. "I ride the lead horse to the way station. It's 10 miles up the pass. I'll bring back a wagon tomorrow." Hodges didn't wait for her approval. He scrambled onto the bare back of a massive roan. "You're leaving me here?" "Ain't got a choice, lady. The other horses are spooked. They won't carry double without a saddle. You stay in the coach. Keep out of the wind." He looked up at the sky. A snowflake drifted down, landing on the brim of his hat. "I'll be back by mid-morning, if the snow don't drift too high." He kicked the horse and rode off. Candy stood in the dirt, the wind whipping her skirts around her ankles, and watched him disappear around the bend. She was alone. The silence rushed in, vast and terrifying. The mountains didn't care about a busted axle. They didn't care about a rejected bride. They were made of rock and ice, indifferent to the petty struggles of blood and bone. Candy turned back to the tilted carriage. It offered shelter, but no warmth. She climbed inside, pulled her coat tight, and waited. The snow began to fall in earnest, fat, white flakes that quickly covered the dirt road, painting the world in a blinding, terrifying white. High above, on the ridge, hidden in the dense stand of blue spruce, a man lowered his spyglass. He had seen the whole thing. The broken axle, the coward riding off, the woman left behind in a tin can of a coach while a blizzard rolled in. Wyatt Kincaid chewed on the inside of his cheek. He didn't like people. He liked them even less when they brought their foolishness onto his mountain. He should let her freeze. It was the law of the high country. The weak die. But he kept seeing the way she had stood there in the dirt. No hysterics. No waving arms. Just watching the driver leave. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow, strapped his rifle to his back, and began the steep descent. The cold seeped through the floorboards of the carriage, crawling up Candy's legs like a living thing. She had wrapped herself in a mouldy wool blanket she found under the seat, but her teeth were already chattering. The wind howled through the cracks in the door, a high, lonely sound. It was getting dark. Fast. Candy closed her eyes. She thought of Preston Caldwell's clean, soft hands. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. The agency had sold her on the dream of a successful merchant, a warm home, a new start. Instead, she was going to freeze to death in a ditch because her face didn't match a fantasy. A heavy thud shook the carriage. Candy jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She scrambled back against the upholstered seat. A wolf, a bear. The carriage door was wrenched open. A massive shape filled the frame, blocking out the grey light of the storm. Candy grabbed the heavy iron lug wrench Hodges had left on the floor. She gripped it with both hands, ready to swing. "Put the iron down, sister," a voice rumbled. It was deep, rough as bark. "Unless you're looking to tenderize me before you eat me." The man leaned in. He smelled of wood smoke, wet wool, and pine resin. He was huge, bundled in a heavy canvas coat, and a battered felt hat pulled low over his eyes. His beard was thick and dark, shot through with silver, and his face was weathered like an old saddle. He looked at the wrench in her hands, then up at her face. His eyes were grey, like the storm outside. "Driver left you," he stated. It wasn't a question. "He went for a wagon," Candy said. Her voice trembled, betraying the cold. "He's coming back. He went for his own skin. By tomorrow morning, this pass will be under 4 feet of drift. Ain't no wagon making it up here for a week." The man held out a massive leather-gloved hand. "Grab your things. My cabin is 2 miles up the ridge." Candy hesitated. A stranger in the woods. But the alternative was certain death. She looked at his hand, then met his grey eyes. They weren't kind, but they weren't cruel either. They were just deeply, profoundly practical. "I have a grip," she said. "Bring it." She grabbed her canvas bag. He didn't offer to carry it for her. He just turned his back to the wind and started walking. Candy followed. The snow was already past her ankles. The wind tore at her shawl, whipping her face with icy needles. Wyatt set a punishing pace, his long legs eating up the steep incline. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He expected her to keep up or die trying. Candy gritted her teeth. Her lungs burned. Her boots, sensible as they were, had no traction in the slick snow. She slipped, falling hard onto her knees. The canvas grip tumbled from her numb fingers. Wyatt stopped. He turned around, watching her struggle in the snow. He didn't say a word. He didn't rush to help her up. Candy didn't wait for him to. She pushed herself up, grabbed the handle of her bag, and took a deep, shuddering breath. She brushed the snow from her skirt and looked at him. "Lead on," she said, her voice tight. Wyatt's eyes narrowed slightly. A flicker of something crossed his face, surprise, perhaps, or a grudging respect. He turned back around and continued up the mountain. But his pace slowed just a fraction, enough for her to keep him in sight. The hike was an eternity of white. Candy lost feeling in her toes, then her fingers. Her mind began to blur. She focused entirely on the broad back of the man in front of her. Step, drag, step, drag. She would not stop. She would not let this mountain break her. Just when she thought her legs would give out entirely, a square of yellow light appeared through the swirling snow. It was a cabin built low to the ground out of massive, unpeeled logs. The roof was pitched steep, a stone chimney belching thick wood smoke into the night sky. Wyatt pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped aside. "Get in," he said, over the roar of the wind. Candy stumbled over the threshold. The heat hit her like a physical blow. It smelled of roasting meat and dry cedar. She dropped her bag and leaned against the wall, her chest heaving. She was dripping wet, shivering violently, her hair plastered to her skull. Wyatt kicked the door shut behind them, dropping the heavy iron bar into place. The sound of the storm was instantly muffled. He took off his hat and shrugged out of his heavy coat, hanging it on a peg by the door. "Take off the wet things," he ordered, walking over to the cast-iron stove. He grabbed an enameled pot and poured a dark, thick liquid into a tin cup. Before the pneumonia sets in. Candy looked around the cabin. It was one room. Functional. Spare. A bed in the corner covered in furs. A sturdy wooden table. Shelves lined with jarred preserves, ammunition, and tools. There was no parlor. No velvet curtains. She turned away from him and clumsily began to unbutton her ruined boots. Her fingers were stiff, refusing to work the small laces. Wyatt walked over and set the tin cup on the table. He watched her struggle for a moment. Then he knelt on the floor in front of her. Candy flinched back. "Hold still," he grunted. He batted her numb hands away. His fingers were large, calloused, yet surprisingly deft. He untied the frozen laces and pulled her boots off. Then he took her bare, ice-cold feet in his large, warm hands. The shock of the heat made Candy gasp. "You're near frostbit," he muttered, rubbing her feet briskly. He didn't look at her face. He was focused entirely on the task. "Drink the coffee. It's bitter, but it's hot." Candy reached for the cup. She took a sip. It was terrible, thick as mud, and tasted like burnt chicory. It was the best thing she had ever had. She wrapped her hands around the tin, absorbing the heat. "Thank you," she managed to say. Her voice sounded thin in the quiet cabin. Wyatt stood up. He walked over to a chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out a heavy flannel shirt. He tossed it onto the table. "Change out of that dress. You can sleep in the bed tonight. I'll take the floor near the stove." "I don't want to put you out," Candy said, her pride flaring up even now. "I'm fine by the fire." Wyatt stopped. He turned and looked at her, really looked at her. He took in her sharp jaw, her plain brown hair, the sheer exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes. "You ain't fine," he said softly. "You're half dead. Pride don't keep a body warm, sister. Put the shirt on." He turned his back to her and began tending the fire. Candy watched his broad shoulders move under his worn canvas shirt. She reached for the flannel. The storm raged for 3 days. It didn't just snow, it buried the world. The wind slammed against the heavy logs of the cabin like a battering ram. Inside, the world was reduced to the crackle of the wood stove, the smell of salted venison, and the uneasy dance of 2 strangers sharing a confined space. Candy learned his name was Wyatt Kincaid. He learned she was Candy Green, bound for nowhere, returned by a man who found her lacking. They didn't talk much. Wyatt wasn't a man of words. He moved around the cabin with a quiet, deliberate efficiency. He chopped wood at the sheltered lean-to, out back repaired a broken snowshoe with rawhide strips, and read from a battered volume of Emerson by the light of a kerosene lamp. Candy didn't sit idle. The morning after the rescue, despite her aching muscles, she took over the domestic duties. She scrubbed the cast-iron skillets with sand and ash until they gleamed. She mended a tear in his wool trousers with small, tight, perfect stitches. She baked soda biscuits that rose high and flaky, a vast improvement over his hardtack. She expected him to ignore her efforts, or perhaps gruffly accept them as his due. Preston Caldwell had expected perfection and had only noticed when things were flawed. But on the third evening, as they sat across from each other at the small wooden table, eating a stew of dried elk and root vegetables, Wyatt stopped eating. He put his spoon down and stared at her hands. Candy pulled them off the table, hiding them in her lap. She knew what they looked like. They were not the hands of a lady. They were broad, the knuckles slightly swollen, the skin rough and calloused from years of lye soap scrub brushes and hauling firewood. "Hide 'em if you want," Wyatt said, his voice a low rumble. "But they're the first thing I noticed." Candy looked up defensive. "I know they aren't pretty, Mr. Kincaid. You don't need to point it out. I'm well aware of my shortcomings." Wyatt leaned back in his chair. The lantern light caught the silver in his beard. "Shortcomings. Is that what the fella in Bitter Creek told you?" Candy looked away, staring at the scarred wood of the table. "Mr. Caldwell had a certain aesthetic in mind. I did not meet his requirements." Wyatt scoffed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. "Caldwell owns the dry goods store. I know him. Sells watered-down whiskey and overcharges for flour. Wears a bowler hat and thinks it makes him a king." He reached across the table. Slowly, deliberately, he took her left hand from her lap. Candy tensed, expecting him to mock her. Instead, he turned her hand over his thumb, tracing the thick calluses at the base of her fingers. "Look at this," he said quietly. "This here is a story. It's early mornings in a freezing house. It's hauling water. It's a woman who knows how to survive when the world stops being soft." He dropped her hand, but his gaze held hers. "Caldwell brought a woman up here 2 years ago, from Boston. Had skin like milk and hands like a porcelain doll. She was beautiful, I suppose, if you like things that break when you drop 'em." Candy swallowed hard. "What happened to her?" "Winter happened," Wyatt said bluntly. "First blizzard, she locked herself in a room and cried for a week. By spring, she took the first stage back east. Couldn't stand the dirt. Couldn't stand the quiet. Caldwell likes the idea of a woman Candy. He likes a painting he can hang on his wall and brag about to the mayor." Wyatt leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The space between them suddenly felt very small. "I live on a mountain," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the rough edge of a saw blade. "I don't need a painting. I don't need lace. I don't need a woman who faints when a bear crosses the porch." He looked at her face, not with the dismissive glance of Preston Caldwell, but with a heavy, unblinking assessment. He saw the sharp jaw, the lack of paint, the stoic set of her mouth. "I've had fancy," Wyatt said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I've seen what it does when the frost hits. I want real. I want a woman who can walk through a blizzard and not complain. I want a woman who knows the value of a fire." Candy's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever looked at her like this. Not like she was a disappointment, but like she was exactly what was required. It terrified her. "You don't know me, Mr. Kincaid," she whispered. "I know you carried your own bag through 3 feet of snow," he countered. I know you didn't cry when the stage driver left you to die. And I know your biscuits don't taste like ash. Out here, that's knowing enough to start." He stood up, taking his empty bowl to the wash basin. He didn't ask for a promise. He didn't offer a proposal. He just laid out the truth of his world and left it there for her to pick up or leave. Candy looked down at her hands resting on the table. The rough skin, the short, sensible nails. For the first time in her life, she didn't wish they belonged to someone else. She listened to the wind howling outside the thick log walls. The storm was still raging, burying the trail back to Bitter Creek, burying the memory of Preston Caldwell. Inside the fire burned hot, and the air smelled of wood smoke and survival. Candy stood up and began to clear the table. The storm broke on the 5th morning. It didn't fade gradually, it simply stopped, as if the mountain had finally exhaled. Candy woke to a silence so absolute it made her ears ring. Sunlight, harsh and blindingly bright, fractured through the ice-caked windows. She sat up, the heavy furs pooling at her waist. Across the room the fire was already built up, snapping and spitting sap. But Wyatt was gone. His heavy coat and snowshoes were missing from their pegs by the door. On the table sat a tin plate with a cold biscuit and a strip of jerky. Beside it lay a heavy Winchester rifle. A piece of charcoal from the hearth had been used to scrawl a rough message on a scrap of brown paper, checking trap lines. "Don't open the door for anything less than 2 legs. If it's 2 legs, keep the rifle pointed at its chest." Candy picked up the heavy weapon. The steel was cold. She knew how to shoot. Her father had been a tenant farmer who expected his daughters to protect the chicken coop from coyotes, but the weight of it here in the vast emptiness of the high country felt different. It felt like survival. She ate the biscuit, the dry crumbs catching in her throat, and looked around the cabin. The water barrel in the corner was empty. The wood box was half full. She could sit and wait for the mountain man to return, wrapping herself in the furs like a fragile thing. Preston Caldwell would have expected her to sit. He would have expected her to wait to be served. Candy stood up. She pulled on her boots, now stiff and dry, and wrapped her shawl tightly around her head and shoulders. She took the empty wooden bucket in one hand and a heavy iron ice spud she found leaning near the hearth in the other. She stepped out the door. The cold hit her teeth like a hammer. The world was buried under a blinding, rolling ocean of white. The pine trees bent double under the weight of the snow. Every breath she took froze the moisture in her nose. The glare was agonizing, but it was beautiful. Brutally, unapologetically beautiful. Wyatt had told her the creek was 50 yards down the slope behind the cabin. She found his snowshoe tracks, deep oval depressions in the powder, and carefully placed her boots inside them to avoid sinking to her waist. The 50 yards felt like a mile. When she finally reached the bottom of the draw, there was no water, only a flat, serpentine ribbon of solid white ice. Candy set the bucket down. She gripped the iron spud with both hands, raised it above her head, and brought it down hard. The ice didn't even chip. The iron bounced back, sending a jarring, agonizing shock up her arms and into her shoulders. She cursed softly a word she hadn't used since she was 16, and swung again. And again. Her breath plumed in the freezing air in ragged gasps. Her shoulders burned. The thin cotton of her dress was no match for the biting wind creeping down the draw, but sweat began to trickle down her spine. Her knuckles scraped against the icy crust of the snowbank, tearing the skin, welling bright red blood that froze almost instantly. She ignored it. She kept swinging. On the 20th strike, the ice cracked. Black, rushing water surged up through the fissure. Candy dropped to her knees, breathing hard, and used the spud to pry the hole wider. She dipped the wooden bucket in the freezing water, splashing her wrists, and hauled it up. It weighed a ton. The trek back up the slope was agony. Her arms shook. Her boots slipped in the icy tracks. But she didn't stop. She wouldn't let the mountain win. She wouldn't let Wyatt Kincaid come back to a useless woman. When Wyatt returned as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, casting the valley in bruised purple shadows, he found the cabin warm. The wood box was full. A pot of water was boiling on the stove. He stomped the snow from his boots, carrying a brace of dead rabbits by their hind legs. He tossed them onto the skinning table near the door and looked around. He noticed the full water barrel. He noticed the wet bucket. Then he looked at Candy. She was sitting by the stove, mending a tear in her skirt. She didn't look up, but she felt his gaze. Wyatt walked over to her. He crouched down, his massive frame blocking the heat of the fire. Without asking, he reached out and took her left hand. Candy flinched. The knuckles were raw, scraped clean of skin, the cuts sluggishly weeping. Ice was thick. Wyatt noted his voice low. "Thick enough," Candy said, refusing to pull her hand away. "Your spud is dull, Mr. Kincaid. It requires a whetstone." Wyatt stared at her hand for a long moment. He didn't offer pity. He didn't tell her she shouldn't have done it. He simply rubbed his thumb over the uninjured part of her palm, a calloused, rough touch that sent a strange heat straight up her arm. "I'll sharpen it tomorrow," he said. He let her hand go and stood up. "Come over here. If you're going to eat my rabbits, you're going to learn how to skin them." Candy smiled. It was a small thing, barely turning the corners of her mouth, but it felt monumental. She set her mending aside and walked over to the table. They worked side by side in the dim light, the only sounds the scrape of the skinning knife and the crackle of the fire. It was a shared silence. It was the rhythm of a life she was beginning to understand. 2 days later, the Chinook winds arrived. Warm air rolled over the mountains, turning the surface of the snow to slush and sending 1,000 tiny waterfalls cascading down the rock faces. The pass was treacherous, but passable. "Pack your grip," Wyatt said over breakfast. He was oiling his rifle, not looking at her. "Snow's melting fast. If we don't head down today, the mud will make the road impassable for another week." Candy's stomach clenched. A cold dread, heavier than the winter air, settled in her chest. Going down meant returning to Bitter Creek. It meant facing the reality of her empty pockets and the sneering face of Preston Caldwell. Wyatt hadn't asked her to stay. He had spoken of what he wanted, a real woman, a survivor. But he was a mountain man. Independence was etched into his bones. He had saved her life, fed her, sheltered her. That didn't equate to a proposal. "All right," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the warmth that had grown between them over the past week. She packed her meager belongings in silence. Wyatt bound 2 pairs of snowshoes to their boots. The journey down was a grueling, knee-jarring exercise in endurance. The blinding white gave way to the ugly brown and grey of the lower elevations. The pristine silence of the timberline was replaced by the sound of dripping water and settling mud. By the time the wooden roofs of Bitter Creek came into view, Candy felt physically sick. The town looked small, dirty. The air smelled of wood-rot horse manure and sulphur from the nearby mines. It was a stark contrast to the sharp, clean scent of pine and ozone she had left behind. They walked down the center of the muddy thoroughfare. People stopped to stare. A woman, presumed dead or frozen, walking out of the mountains alongside Wyatt Kincaid, a man known to shoot first and avoid conversation entirely. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men watched with narrowed, speculative eyes. Candy kept her chin high, her spine rigid. Let them stare. Wyatt didn't seem to notice them. He strode toward the largest building in town, Caldwell's Mercantile. "We don't need to go in there," Candy said, stopping at the edge of the boardwalk. Her voice betrayed a hint of panic. "I have pelts to trade," Wyatt replied, not breaking stride. "And you need a stage ticket." The words felt like a slap, a stage ticket. He was sending her away. The entire week, the quiet dinners, the shared chores, the way he looked at her hands, it was just charity. She followed him up the wooden steps, her boots heavy with mud. The bell above the door jingled sharply. The store was warm and smelled of stale coffee, oiled leather and peppermints. Behind the long mahogany counter stood Preston Caldwell. He wore a crisp grey suit, a gold watch chain draped across his waistcoat, and a look of profound irritation. He looked up. The irritation vanished, replaced by sheer shock. "Miss Green." Caldwell's voice cracked. He looked at her mud-splattered dress, her unkempt hair, and the angry red scrapes on her knuckles. Then he looked at the massive man standing beside her. The stage driver said the coach broke down. He said you were lost to the storm." "Hodges is a coward," Wyatt rumbled, dropping a heavy burlap sack of pelts onto the polished counter. The impact made the glass candy jars rattle. "Left her to freeze." Caldwell recovered his composure quickly, a slick smile stretching across his face. He adjusted his cuffs. "Well, it is a miracle you survived, Miss Green. Though spending a week unchaperoned in a cabin with a man of the woods, I imagine your reputation is as ruined as your gown." He laughed, a dry, reedy sound. "I suppose it's for the best I rejected your contract. A respectable merchant cannot be associated with a woman of compromised virtue." Candy felt the heat rise in her cheeks. The shame Caldwell was trying to inflict was palpable. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to tell him that survival had nothing to do with virtue. But Wyatt moved first. He didn't yell. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply leaned across the counter. He was a foot taller than Caldwell and twice as wide. He invaded the merchant's pristine space, smelling of raw earth-dried blood and absolute danger. Caldwell stepped back, his back hitting the shelving behind him. The slick smile vanished. "You talk about virtue." "Caldwell," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet gravel. "You wouldn't know virtue if it bit you on the leg. You judge a horse by its saddle and a woman by the paint on her face." Wyatt reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He tossed it onto the counter next to the pelts. It hit the wood with the heavy, unmistakable clink of gold coins. $50, Wyatt said, "for a first-class ticket to St. Louis, and the best room in the hotel tonight, plus a hot bath." Candy stared at him, her heart shattering. He was paying to get rid of her. He was buying her way out. Caldwell looked at the gold greed momentarily warring with fear. He reached a trembling hand toward the pouch. Wyatt's massive hand slammed down over the gold, trapping Caldwell's fingers against the wood. Caldwell gasped in pain. "That's what her ticket would cost." Wyatt continued, his grey eyes locked onto Caldwell's terrified face. "But she ain't buying one." Wyatt slowly lifted his hand, releasing the merchant. He turned his back on Caldwell, entirely dismissing him, as if he were an annoying insect, and looked at Candy. The anger in his face melted away. The harshness of the mountain receded. He looked at her plain dress, her dirt-smudged cheeks, and her broad, scarred hands. "I told you I had fancy candy," Wyatt said, ignoring the stares of the other patrons in the store. His voice was steady, meant only for her. "I told you I wanted real." He stepped closer to her. "I brought you down here to give you a choice. I ain't holding you hostage on a mountain. You want the stage, the gold is yours. You want to go back east and find some clerk who likes soft hands, you can." He took off his battered hat, clutching it in his large hands. It was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him. "But if you want to stay," Wyatt said, his voice thick, "if you want to chop ice and skin rabbits and build something that won't wash away when the rain comes, the sled goes back up the mountain in an hour." Candy stood perfectly still. The smells of the mercantile faded. The quiet snickers of the townspeople vanished. There was only Wyatt standing in front of her, offering her not a fantasy, but a brutal, beautiful reality. She looked past him at Preston Caldwell, who was rubbing his bruised fingers, looking furious and small. She realized then that Caldwell's world was a prison of velvet and judgment. Wyatt's world was hard, but it was vast. And it was free. Candy reached out. She didn't take the pouch of gold. She reached past it and took Wyatt's large, calloused hand in hers. "The axe needs sharpening, Mr. Kincaid," she said, her voice ringing clear and steady in the quiet store. "We shouldn't waste daylight." The journey back up the mountain was not a retreat. It was a claiming. The Chinook had melted the surface snow, but the sudden drop in temperature at dusk turned the trail into a jagged staircase of black ice and frozen mud. They didn't speak much. Breath was better saved for the climb. Wyatt pulled the heavy supply sled, the thick leather harness digging into his shoulders. Candy walked beside him, matching his punishing rhythm step for step. When her boots slipped on the ice, she didn't cry out. She dropped to a knee, found her purchase, and stood back up. Wyatt watched her out of the corner of his eye. He didn't offer a hand to pull her up, and she didn't wait for one. It was the quietest, truest understanding they had reached yet. They reached the cabin well after dark. The fire had burned down to grey ash, leaving the air inside bitter and sharp. Candy didn't wait for instructions. She went straight to the woodbox, gathered a handful of dry cedar shavings, and knelt before the hearth. She struck the match, cupping the tiny flame with her scarred, calloused hands, blowing gently until the shavings caught. Wyatt unhitched himself from the sled and brought in the sacks of flour, coffee, and salt. He watched her work the fire. The yellow light threw long, dancing shadows against the log walls, softening the harsh angles of her face. "You left the gold," Wyatt said abruptly. Candy placed a thick split of pine onto the growing fire. She watched the bark blister and smoke. "I didn't earn it, and I didn't want the stage ticket it bought. You could have taken it anyway. A woman alone ought to have a stake." She stood up, dusting the ash from her skirt, and turned to face him. "I'm not a woman alone, Wyatt. Not unless you're telling me to walk back down." Wyatt stood still for a long moment. He unbuttoned his heavy canvas coat and hung it on the peg. Then he walked over to the small wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He opened it, rummaged past spare ammunition and wool socks, and pulled out a long, narrow object wrapped in oiled leather. He walked back to the hearth and held it out to her. Candy took it. The weight of it was substantial in her palm. She unwrapped the leather cord, revealing a hunting knife. The blade was high-carbon steel, dark and meticulously oiled, honed to a razor edge. The handle was carved from a solid piece of elk antler, worn smooth by years of use, fastened with brass rivets. It wasn't new. It was a tool that had seen blood weather and survival. "My father gave me that," Wyatt said. His voice was low, devoid of any theatrical weight, yet heavy with intent. "Told me a knife is only as good as the hand holding it. A weak hand will drop it. A foolish hand will cut itself. A steady hand will build a life with it." Candy ran her thumb flat along the side of the blade, respecting the edge. It was the most practical, profound gift she had ever received. Preston Caldwell had offered a velvet box and a life of decandative confinement. Wyatt Kincaid was offering her a weapon, a tool and a partner's trust. "I don't hold with preachers' candy," Wyatt continued, staring at the fire. "I've seen too many men swear an oath in a church on Sunday and beat their wives black and blue by Wednesday. A piece of paper in a courthouse down in Bitter Creek don't mean a damn thing up here when the winter comes." He turned his grey eyes on her. They were steady, clear, and stripped of all pretense. "I can't promise you soft. The mountain don't allow it. We'll freeze in the winter and break our backs in the summer. But I can promise you honest. You eat when I eat. You stand where I stand. I won't ever ask you to hide your hands, and I won't ever send you away." Candy looked at the rough-hewn man before her. Her chest felt tight, a strange, fierce ache blooming behind her ribs. She didn't cry. Crying was for women who needed saving. She just nodded, gripping the antler handle of the knife. "Honest is all I ever wanted." "Wyatt," she said. She walked over to the wooden shelf above the wash basin. She unclasped her canvas grip. She didn't take out lace or perfume. She took out a heavy iron whetstone she had brought from her father's farm in Missouri, a block of lye soap, and a small tin box of sewing needles. She lined them up on the rough wood. She wasn't a guest anymore. She was home. Spring came to the high territory, not with a whisper, but with a violent shout. The snowmelt turned the creek into a roaring torrent of white water. The blue spruce shook off their icy armor, and the ground exploded in a chaotic carpet of purple lupine and bitterroot. Candy changed with the mountain. The pale, drawn woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in a drab cotton dress was gone. Her skin had tanned to the color of pale leather, baked by the high-altitude sun. Her arms, always sturdy, had grown hard and corded from chopping wood, hauling water, and breaking the stubborn earth behind the cabin for a root garden. She wore a pair of Wyatt's old canvas trousers, cut down and hemmed, and one of his flannel shirts over her dress bodice. She looked like the land unforgiving, unpainted, and deeply alive. It was mid-June when the trouble finally rode up the trail. Wyatt was half a mile up the ridge, clearing a deadfall that had blocked the upper game trail. Candy was on her knees in the dirt beside the cabin, carefully weeding the fragile shoots of potatoes and carrots. The heavy thud of hooves warned her before they cleared the timberline. Candy didn't gasp or scramble. She calmly set her trowel down, wiped her dirt-caked hands on her canvas thighs, and stood up. She walked unhurriedly to the porch, picked up the Winchester rifle leaning against the doorframe, and levered a round into the chamber with a sharp, metallic clack. She held the weapon loosely across her chest and waited. 3 riders broke through the tree line. They weren't local trappers. They rode expensive grain-fed Morgans that were already blowing hard from the altitude. The man in the lead wore a bowler hat, a tailored grey suit ruined by trail dust, and a sneer. Preston Caldwell. Flanking him were 2 men Candy recognized from the saloon alleys of Bitter Creek, hired muscle, rough men who smelled of cheap whiskey and bad intentions. They carried repeating rifles in their saddle scabbards and wore heavy sidearms. Caldwell reined his horse in 20 yards from the cabin, his eyes scanning the property. He didn't see Wyatt. A smug satisfaction settled over his features. Then he looked at Candy. He took in the canvas trousers, the dirt on her face, and the rifle in her hands. He laughed. It was a thin, cruel sound. "Look at you!" Caldwell called out, his voice carrying over the rush of the creek. "A regular savage. The agency in St. Louis would be horrified to see what their refined stock has degraded into." "You're trespassing, Caldwell," Candy said. Her voice was flat, projecting easily across the clearing. She didn't raise the rifle, but her finger rested lightly against the trigger guard. "State your business or turn around." "I have business with Kincaid," Caldwell said, his smile dropping. "He owes me. $50 in gold, or the equivalent in pelts. He humiliated me in my own store, drove off my customers and stole merchandise. He bought my ticket. You kept the gold. A misunderstanding. The gold was lost in the commotion." Caldwell lied smoothly. "And since he isn't here to pay his debts, I've brought the sheriff's deputies to collect. We'll be taking those prime winter furs I know he has curing in the shed." The 2 hired men shifted in their saddles' hands, moving closer to their irons. They weren't deputies. There were no tin stars on their chests. Caldwell was using the isolation of the mountain to commit a robbery under the guise of wounded pride. "There are no furs for you," Candy said. "And there's no debt. Now get off this claim. You don't give the orders, you plain-faced scrub." Caldwell spat, his facade of civility breaking. He nodded to the man on his right. "Go check the shed. If she points that gun at you, shoot the dog." The rider spurred his horse forward. Candy brought the Winchester to her shoulder in one fluid, practiced motion. She didn't aim at the man. She aimed at the dirt 6 inches in front of the Morgan's hooves and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was deafening in the clearing. Dirt and rock shattered upward. The Morgan screamed, rearing back wildly. The hired man fought to stay in the saddle, cursing as he grabbed for the horn, his own rifle slipping from his grasp and tumbling into the mud. Silence slammed back down on the clearing, ringing in their ears. Candy pumped the lever, ejecting the smoking brass casing. It arched through the air and landed by her boot. She kept the rifle shouldered, now aiming dead center at Caldwell's chest. "I don't miss twice," Candy said calmly. "And I don't shoot horses. The next round goes through your custom waistcoat, Mr. Caldwell." Caldwell stared at her, his face pale beneath the dust. This wasn't the cowed, rejected bride he remembered. This was a woman with iron in her spine and cold steel in her hands. "You're crazy," one of the hired men muttered, struggling to calm his panicked horse. "She ain't crazy. She's just home." The voice rumbled from the edge of the timberline, deep and terrifyingly calm. Caldwell whipped his head around. Wyatt stepped out of the shadows of the spruce trees. He held his own rifle cocked and leveled at the second hired man. Wyatt didn't look like a man who had been clearing brush. He looked like the apex predator of the Bitterroot's, eyes dark and locked on his prey. "Drop the iron, boys," Wyatt commanded. The hired men looked at Wyatt, then back at Candy. 2 rifles trained and steady. They weren't being paid enough to die on a muddy ridge. Slowly, deliberately, they raised their hands, backing their horses away from the cabin. Wyatt walked into the clearing, never taking his eyes off the intruders. He stopped beside Candy. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't try to take the rifle from her hands. He simply stood, shoulder to shoulder with her, a united, impenetrable front. "You got a lot of nerve, Caldwell," Wyatt said, his voice dropping an octave. "Riding up to my land, threatening my wife." Caldwell swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the 2 barrels. "Your wife? There's no record of a marriage." "I don't need a record for the county clerk," Wyatt growled. "She belongs to this mountain. She belongs with me. You ever ride up this trail again, Caldwell, I won't waste a bullet warning you. I'll bury you under the deadfall and let the wolves sort out the paperwork." Wyatt racked the lever of his rifle. It was a universal sound, a final warning. "Turn around," Candy added, her voice steady. "And don't look back." Caldwell glared at them, his pride in absolute tatters. He yanked the reins of his horse, hauling the beast around brutally. The 2 hired men eagerly followed suit, their bravado completely shattered. Wyatt and Candy stood in the dirt, their shoulders brushing, and watched the 3 men ride back down the mountain, fleeing the wild they could not tame. They waited until the sound of hooves faded completely into the rush of the creek. Slowly, Candy lowered the rifle. She let out a long, slow breath, feeling the adrenaline begin to drain from her limbs. Wyatt turned to look at her. He looked at the smoking barrel of her Winchester, then up at her face. A slow, genuine smile spread across his weathered features, reaching his grey eyes. It was a rare, beautiful thing. "Shot a little low," he noted dryly. Candy looked back at him, the corner of her mouth twitching upward. "I hit exactly what I aimed at." She turned, carrying the rifle, and walked back toward the vegetable patch. The potatoes still needed weeding. August was a kiln. The high country dried out baking under a relentless white sun that turned the vibrant green of early summer into a brittle, desperate yellow. The creek, which had roared with spring melt, shrank to a sluggish trickle over mossy stones. The air grew tight. It smelled of hot resin, cured pine needles and dust. Out here, summer wasn't a season of leisure. It was a race against the inevitable return of the snow. Candy and Wyatt worked from before dawn until the last purple light faded behind the peaks. They salted meat. They smoked fish. Candy harvested the root garden, her hands buried in the warm, dry earth, pulling up heavy knobby potatoes and thick carrots. She laid them out on canvas tarps to cure, guarding them fiercely from the jays and ground squirrels. They moved around each other with a silent, synchronized rhythm. They didn't need to speak to know what the other was doing. If Wyatt was chopping wood, Candy was stacking it. If Candy was boiling down berries for preserves, Wyatt was hunting the high ridges to fill the meat cache. Their partnership was forged in sweat and necessity, far deeper than any paper contract signed in a clean office. Then came the dry storms. They rolled in late one Tuesday afternoon. The sky bruised a sickly bruised plum color. The wind stopped dead. The birds went utterly silent. The air pressure dropped so fast, Candy felt it pop in her ears. "Get the buckets," Wyatt shouted from the lean-to. He wasn't walking, he was running. "Fill everything. Tubs, pots, the wash basin. Now." Candy didn't ask questions. She dropped her basket of dried apples and grabbed the 2 wooden buckets. She ran for the creek. There was no rain. Just a suffocating stillness followed by a blinding flash of blue-white light. The thunder didn't rumble. It cracked like a cannon shot directly overhead. The ground shook. Candy stumbled water splashing down her canvas trousers. She looked up the ridge. A massive dead ponderosa pine, standing 50 yards above the cabin, had taken a direct hit. The dry wood exploded outward in a shower of splinters and sparks. Within seconds, the crown of the tree was a torch against the bruised sky. The wind woke up. It didn't bring rain, it brought oxygen. The fire leaped from the dead pine to the dry brush below, crawling down the slope toward the cabin like a living, hungry thing. "Candy!" Wyatt bellowed. He emerged from the shed carrying 2 heavy iron shovels and a Pulaski axe. He threw a shovel at her feet. "Dig 3 feet wide, down to the dirt. We have to cut a break." Candy dropped the buckets. She grabbed the heavy shovel. The heat hit them a minute later. It was a physical blow, a wall of suffocating dry air that sucked the moisture straight out of her throat. The roar of the fire was deafening a freight train, barreling through the timber. Smoke thick and acrid rolled down the slope, stinging her eyes and choking her lungs. She dug. She drove the iron blade into the dry earth, turning over rocks and tearing through stubborn pine roots. Sweat poured down her face, instantly turning to black mud as the ash began to fall like snow. Beside her, Wyatt was a machine. He swung the Pulaski with terrifying force, severing thick roots and dragging away dead brush to starve the approaching flames. They didn't look at each other. They didn't stop to breathe. The fire was 20 yards away. Then 15. Sparks rained down, burning tiny holes in Candy's flannel shirt. One landed on the back of her neck. It bit deep, a sharp, searing agony. She gritted her teeth, ignored it, and kept digging. The mountain didn't care about pain. The fire didn't care about the home they had built. It only consumed. "Back up!" Wyatt roared over the deafening crackle of burning timber. "Get to the porch!" Candy threw a final shovelful of dirt onto the fire line and stumbled backward. Her arms were trembling so violently she could barely hold the handle. The wall of flames hit the dirt trench they had cut. It reared up a 10-foot wall of orange and red, searching for fuel. The heat was unbearable. Candy shielded her face with her arms, standing on the porch beside Wyatt. He held a soaked wool blanket, his chest heaving his face, unrecognizable beneath a mask of soot. They watched. The world was burning. The fire paced the edge of the trench, angry and starved. A gust of wind pushed the flames toward the cabin roof. Wyatt lunged forward, throwing the wet blanket over the blistering logs of the outer wall, beating back the embers that drifted across the gap. Candy grabbed her shovel again. Where the fire tried to creep across the trench through the dry grass, she beat it to death with the flat of the iron blade. They fought the mountain for 3 hours. They fought until the muscles in their backs screamed, until their hands were blistered and bleeding beneath the calluses. They fought with a desperate, cynical fury, refusing to let the wild take back what they had claimed. Slowly, agonizingly, the wind shifted. The fire, starved of fuel at the trench and blown back onto its own ashes, began to lay down. The 10-foot wall shrank to 5, then to a creeping line of smouldering orange embers. The roar faded into a hiss. Candy dropped the shovel. It hit the wooden porch with a dull thud. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the steps. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs felt scorched. Wyatt stood a few feet away, leaning heavily on the handle of his Pulaski. He looked at the blackened, smoking earth that stopped a mere 10 feet from their door. He looked at the garden, entirely untouched. Then he dropped the axe and turned to her. Dawn broke grey and quiet. The smoke hung low in the valley, a thick, choking fog that blotted out the sun. The timberline was a graveyard of blackened, smoking spikes. It smelled of ruin. But the cabin stood. Candy sat on the edge of the porch. She was numb. Her hands rested in her lap, coated in a thick layer of black grease and ash. Her knuckles were split. The burn on the back of her neck throbbed with a dull, relentless rhythm. She stared at the smouldering tree line, processing the sheer violence of what they had just survived. Preston Caldwell would have fled. He would have hitched his wagon at the first smell of smoke and abandoned the structure to the flames. He would have called it a loss and ordered replacement goods. Wyatt walked out of the cabin. He carried a tin basin of warm water, a clean rag, and a tin cup of coffee. He moved slowly. He limped slightly, a burn on his left thigh, where an ember had caught his trousers. He set the cup on the porch railing beside her. Then he knelt in the dirt at her feet. Candy looked down at him. His face was a mask of soot. His grey eyes were bloodshot, the lashes singed short. He looked wild, exhausted, and utterly unbroken. He dipped the rag into the warm water. He didn't ask for her hands. He took them. He worked the rag over her skin with a shocking gentleness. He washed away the black ash, revealing the scraped knuckles, the fresh blisters, the dirt packed deep beneath her fingernails. He washed them with the reverence of a man handling something priceless. "We held the line," Wyatt said, his voice a raspy whisper. Smoke had ruined his throat. "We did," Candy croaked. He moved the rag to her face. He washed the soot from her cheeks, wiping away the dark streaks from her sharp jaw. He traced the high curve of her cheekbone with his thumb. "Most women would have run," Wyatt said. He looked deeply into her eyes, searching past the exhaustion. "When the tree crowned, most men would have run too." "I told you I'm not running, Wyatt." He dropped the rag into the muddy water. He stayed on his knees, his massive hands resting on her canvas-clad thighs. "I bought a claim out here because I hated the world." Wyatt said, the cynical edge of his voice returning, softened only by the intimacy of the moment. "I hated the lies people tell each other, the way they dress up their rot in silk and Sunday suits. I figured the mountain was honest. It kills you, but it doesn't lie to you." He leaned in closer. The smell of smoke and sweat was intoxicating. It was the smell of absolute reality. "I thought I had to be alone, to be honest," he murmured. I was wrong. He reached up and cupped her face. His calloused thumbs brushed against her skin. "You're the most real thing I've ever known, Candy Green," Wyatt said. "I don't just want you here. I need you here." It wasn't a poem. It wasn't a sonnet. It was a brutal, beautiful admission pulled from the ashes of a forest fire. It was worth more than all the gold in Caldwell's safe. Candy leaned into his heavy, scarred hands. "I'm not going anywhere, Wyatt. This is my claim, too." He stood up, pulling her up with him. He didn't kiss her gently. He kissed her the way a starving man takes bread. It was fierce tasting of ash and stale coffee, desperate and profound. Candy anchored her hands in his soot-stained hair, pulling him closer, letting the solid weight of him ground her. They had survived the rejection of the town below. They had survived the blinding cold of the winter. They had survived the fire. The years ahead would not be soft. The snow would return thick and merciless. The crops would fail. The wolves would circle the meat cache. But as Candy stood on the porch of the log cabin, wrapped in the arms of the mountain man, she felt an absolute, unshakable peace. Down in the valley, men like Preston Caldwell would continue to buy fragile things and watch them break. They would live in their painted houses and complain about the dust. Up here on the ridge, the timber was burned, the air was bitter, and their hands were bruised. But as the sun finally broke through the heavy blanket of smoke, casting a harsh golden light over the surviving logs of their home, Candy knew the truth. They didn't just have a life. They had a foundation. And it was forged in fire, carved in ice, and real as the earth beneath their boots. If you felt the heat of the fire and the gritty truth of Wyatt and Candy's unbroken bond, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a story about survival and real love, and subscribe to the channel. We bring you deeply human-grounded tales from